Ewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, why anxiety is good for you even though it feels bad. Today's guest confronts our pervasive misunderstanding of anxiety and presents a new framework for reimagining and reclaiming the confounding emotion as the advantage it evolved to be. Dr. Tracy Dennic-Tiwary is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Hunter College, the City University of New York, where she directs the Emotion Regulation Lab and is co-founder of the digital therapeutics company Wise Therapeutics. She received her doctoral and postdoctoral training in clinical psychology at the Pennsylvania State University and New York University School of Medicine. She has published over 100 scientific articles in top peer-reviewed journals and delivered more than 300 presentations at academic conferences and for corporate clients. Dr. Dennic-Tiwary has been featured throughout the media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS, ABC, CNN, NPR, and Bloomberg Television, and she lives in New York City with her family. She has a book out. It's called Future Tense: Why Anxiety is Good for You Even Though It Feels Bad. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Tracy. It was intellectually stimulating, but I have to say, while I do mostly agree with her, I still hold some reservations about some of the ideas. As a regular listener, you know that the topic of anxiety is of interest to me. And recently, I have published 2 episodes all about anxiety. Episode 317, The Anatomy of Anxiety, with phenomenal Dr. Ellen Vora. She's a holistic psychiatrist and the author of The Anatomy of Anxiety. And episode 312, Unwinding Anxiety, with Dr. Brewer, who is a neuroscientist and addiction psychiatrist and the author of Unwinding Anxiety. Both of those conversations are really eye-opening, thought-provoking, and very informative. Many of us struggle with anxiety, and while we crave relief and we want to overcome or eradicate it, can we view anxiety as a gift and harness it to our advantage? By thinking about anxiety as an unwanted affliction, we do everything in our power to do away with it, says Dr. Tracy Dennic-Tiwary. But when we accept the discomfort of anxiety and listen to what it's teaching us, we become more creative. And when it comes to children, too often, we react to their anxiety with accommodation and overprotection. We do so with the best of intention, but our kids are not fragile. And lastly, if you change your mindset about anxiety, you can change how you experience it. She argues that we can and we must learn to be anxious in the right way. Please enjoy this thought-provoking, provocative, and very lively conversation with Tracy Dennic-Tiwary. Tracy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Anna. It's such a pleasure to be with you.
I am excited to talk about anxiety again, since it's been the topic of the recent episodes of my podcast. I have recently interviewed Dr. Brewer, the author of Unwinding Anxiety. I recently interviewed Dr. Ellen Vora, The Anatomy of Anxiety, the author of, and now here is Tracy, Dr. Tracy Dennic-Tiwary. And your book is called Future Tense, which I like that title, Why Anxiety is Good for You, Even Though It Feels Bad. First of all, I want to say I took some lines from your book, which to me sounds very interesting because it just showcases what your book is about, because you have a completely different take on anxiety, right? Here are a couple of sentences. Anxiety is useful. Anxiety is freedom. Anxiety is a wellspring of creativity. There are the gifts of anxiety. And may I just say, you just recently wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal in praise of anxiety. So talk to me. As a person who suffers from anxiety, I can tell you that it's not freedom, definitely. I see the usefulness of it. Mm-hmm. I disagree with the disease model of it. Mm-hmm. I could even see the gifts of it, but the creativity and some of those aspects. So what I want you to talk about, first of all, I want to ask you one question. Mm-hmm. And forgive me that I'm getting too long in my intro. I know you run the lab, the emotion regulation lab, right? And you can tell me what you studied there. And I'm assuming it's not only anxiety that you focus on, but why is the topic of anxiety personally important for you, that you felt compelled to write a whole book and to deliver this big message loud and clear? Even though you yourself didn't suffer from anxiety, you said you suffered from depression.
That's right.
I want to know why, what's your why and what drives your passion?
Thank you for starting with that question, because I think, as a scientist for 20 years, we learn reflexively to put our passion aside sometimes, to think that really we're objective. And I have been a scientist for 20 years. And this book was my first attempt to really take a step back and look at the career I've devoted myself to, as well as how my own personal life plays into that. I have to start the story actually back in 2001. Which is when I defended my dissertation and officially became a psychologist. It was on September 11th, 2001, meaning the September 11th. And I remember vividly after, I got my degree at Penn State University. The defense started at 9:00 in the morning. The towers had not yet fallen, and we all made the decision to go and do this defense. And when I came out of that defense, not only was I a psychologist, but it was a new world that I was entering into. I was living in New York, so I rushed back to New York and got back just before all the bridges and tunnels closed. And I looked around me, and here we were, more than ever, all of us feeling anxiety, trauma, collectively going through a very difficult period. And I thought, okay, great, in the sense of now I've picked the right profession, because now it's time to get to work. And so I just put my head down. And I devoted myself for 20 years to doing the work, as you say, not just on anxiety, but on our emotional health in general. And I thought, okay, we're going to use science. We're going to beat back the growing mental health crisis. But then when just a few years ago, I sort of looked back up again, past the walls of my lab and those of my colleagues, I realized that actually mental health we weren't in better shape than we were before. We were actually, it seemed that anxiety disorders in particular, as well as other problems like depression, suicide, addiction, and other mental health problems were on the rise. But yet, this is a mystery, because we have excellent science. We have wonderful treatments. We even have science-based wellness practices and self-help that's better than ever before. But we're doing worse. And the answer I came to, and really this is the purpose, if there's one purpose to my book, it's this. The answer I came to is that we mental health professionals have made some terrible mistakes, unintentionally, by promulgating this disease story of anxiety, this idea, and really anxiety in particular, because when I was growing up, stress was sort of the word that described everything we were going through, and now it's anxiety. So it is the most common mental health problem. So starting with anxiety is something that affects us all on many levels. We mental health professionals have really spread false beliefs about anxiety that I believe are unintentionally doing harm. And those beliefs are what you also termed the disease model of anxiety, this idea that anxiety, any experience of it, is dangerous. And so we should protect ourselves from it. That is, it is a potential disease state, which means you prevent it and you eradicate it and you suppress it like you would cancer or COVID. And then the second part of the kind of this disease story is also that it's a malfunction, that it's a failure of happiness, of mental health, of these. And unfortunately, these beliefs, what I argue are false beliefs, are actually having unintentionally harmful consequences. They're causing us to do very unhelpful things when it comes to anxiety. They're causing us to be frightened of anxiety, to avoid it, to suppress it, to not engage with anxiety. And we know that this is a recipe for spiraling anxiety out of control. We know that one of the key problems in an anxiety disorder, when it becomes a disorder, is this chronic avoidance, this difficulty in coping with anxiety. And I believe that so unintentionally, we've sort of created these conditions where we're coping less well. So I don't actually think we're having a mental health crisis of anxiety today. I think we're having a crisis in how we're coping with anxiety.
Well, I'm going to put a pin on that statement because I think I want to explore that more. As a side note, what I want to say to what you're saying, I recently read, I think it was in the New York Times, I believe, I can quickly even look it up, an article about grief, how we need to put grief into how people are not capable of dealing with grief and processing grief. And we have to put that in the DSM-5 now. Have you read that article or are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with that argument and I didn't read the article yet. I noticed it. And I think there's a lot of awareness now about difficult emotions. And I'm very happy about that zeitgeist, that change. I think that grief is part of the human condition. It can also be such that it overwhelms us and we need extra support. But I don't think we humans are incapable of coping with it. And I'm very wary of we have had amazing growing awareness of mental health and illness. That it is wonderful. But one problem with the conversations we've been having is that we often start to believe that we're more fragile than I believe we are. And sometimes we are fragile. That's true. Sometimes we are vulnerable. All of us have vulnerabilities. But when we use language such as, well, oh, you're anxious, let's deal with that right away. Or, we are not capable of dealing with grief. I think we set ourselves up to actually find fewer solutions. I think we disempower ourselves and don't necessarily destigmatize the path, the journey of struggling, the messy human struggle of working with and through all these incredibly difficult experiences and emotions. So I actually take issue with a narrative of we are not capable of dealing with grief. I think that there are moments when we do need that extra help and support. Whether or not we need to put it in the DSM, I would really need to think and discuss that more. And I don't really have an opinion about that.
Yeah, no, it's just to your point that somehow in the West, we see everything through this disease lens, that everything, now we're tackling grief, right? Which is part of human condition. And it's like, it doesn't take 5 stages to go over the grief. It's a lifelong process and we adapt to it and we never resolve it. We covered this on the podcast extensively. The same goes for quote unquote negative feelings, right? We are meant to feel those feelings, including anxiety. But as you said in one of your interviews, it's the new A word.
It's true. It's true.
It's everybody's using it. I myself have overused and misused anxiety.
Me too. It's really in the air right now.
It's the new buzzword. And I like how you're inviting to change the conversation. But aren't you glorifying this a little bit? Like, I think you took it too far. Did you do it on purpose to communicate your message loud and clear, or you truly believe in that?
So I hear what you're saying, because often what we are left with are the catchphrases and the buzzwords that, when we communicate with the media, you develop these simplified phrases and elevator pitches, et cetera. But if you read my book, and I know that you have, but I think if you really read it, I take quite a few pains to really try to convey that I am not saying glorify anxiety. What I'm saying is be curious about it. Because when we accept this messy part of being human and don't reject it or hate it or revile it, we actually stand the best chance of working with it and leveraging it to the advantages that it actually evolved to have. And these are advantages that, because we're so biased against it and equate it with disease, even the scientists who are asking the questions are not always asking the right questions, or we're not spreading the science. Ideas like, there is excellent science to show that when we experience anxiety, we are more creative. There's a great study from DeDrew and colleagues from 2013 in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And they do this incredible thing. Now, this is not clinical anxiety, so I'm very careful to make the distinction between someone suffering from an anxiety disorder and the full spectrum of anxiety. But they induced people in the lab to experience anxiety. They had them, write about a very anxiety-provoking experience they had, and everyone reported that they felt more anxiety. And then they had them do a brainstorming task. Now, we assume when we're anxious, it debilitates us. We assume that it narrows us. But what they found is that people who were anxious were more persistent in problem solving. They overcame obstacles when they had to come up with new solutions. They were more creatively fluent, which means there's not only a greater number of ideas, but higher quality. And they, every time you threw something new their way, as I mentioned about persistence, they kept on thinking outside the box. And so this is an example of a gift of anxiety, that if we assume that as soon as we feel anxiety, we should suppress it or fear it, we lose some of those opportunities. And part of what I'm trying, if there's one thing I'm only trying to do, is not go too far in this mindset shift, but it is the shift of mindset. You might have noticed that I use this kind of metaphor of optical illusion, that Rubens' vase, which is very famous. People will be familiar of it, where you can see in black and white, if you look at it one way, it's just a vase in the center. But then if you let your eyes sort of relax, you see that there's also two people in profile looking across this vase-shaped space at each other. And I think that that's how our view and our mindset about anxiety can be. If we allow ourselves to be more curious and open, I think we'll start doing more right things when it comes to coping. I think we'll start benefiting more from the excellent treatments out there, because we don't have a lack of treatments or science. And even sometimes we need to benefit from medication and psychotherapy and all of these things that can be helpful. But I think we're disrupting our ability to benefit because we're so quick to suppress and revile and hate anxiety.
Yeah, you see articles like overcome your anxiety as if something you need to just conquer and overcome, right? That's the message that you see in social media or in media in general. But anxiety, I read that chapter on creativity. That was the only chapter that I have pushed back against.
Tell me more.
I want to know more about the study. I mean, you mentioned this study, but I would love to see multiple studies, obviously, right, to understand this. Yes. But anxiety, as you said, is on a spectrum from mild ease to panic attacks, which I have experienced both. And of course, if you're clinically anxious, your thinking shuts down, because then you have irrational thoughts that you're going to die. I mean, I can give a personal example. I was walking one day when my anxiety was on a rise in the past 2 years, which were many factors leading to me feeling more anxious, not only during the general pandemic, right? But also my father passed away from COVID and I couldn't go. And so I had the grief and, I'm almost 50. So I'm questioning my own mortality. So there were a lot of factors and dealing my own issues during the pandemic and helping other parents. Doing this work of helping other parents during the pandemic was a very stressful time for many of us. And my anxiety was at the highest, where I was having panic attacks, quote unquote, out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. And I can give you a completely irrational example. Now that I'm thinking about this example, I'm like, was I crazy? I guess I was. I was walking one day.
I would take issue with that.
Walking was the only thing that I was doing a lot during the pandemic, just like many other people. And one day I'm walking, it's a glorious, beautiful, sunny and blue sky day. And all of a sudden I have this thought, what if the air stops in the environment? What if there is not enough oxygen? And I started gasping for air in this open space. There's nobody around me. And I just had a panic attack, and I know exactly where it was, near the stoplight. So clearly in that moment, I don't know what the degree of my anxiety was, right? I can't come up with creative solutions to any problem because I couldn't even soothe myself. So when you say anxiety and creativity are related, I want to explore more. What degree of anxiety are we talking about, right?
Well, a panic attack is, really, it's on the very edge of the spectrum of the spectrum of anxiety. That also, now I don't know if, what your experience is, but for some, panic attacks do become an anxiety disorder. So that is not when we're at our most creative, because by definition, right, there's a series of things that these cycles that have started that are actually, we call it coping with anxiety, but in some ways it's a series of coping mechanisms, unconscious and conscious, that are keeping us from living our life, right, a full life, and that are keeping us from effectively coping with the stresses and distress of our inner and outer life. So at that moment, I would never argue that anxiety is creative, right? I do tell a story about a wonderful artist, Drew, in the book, who actually created a whole immersive art experience about his experience of a panic attack. And so in that sense, and he actually taught me this beautiful phrase, and I've used it ever since, that you're only anxious when you care. And so out of these series of this period of his life when he was experiencing these panic attacks, when he was not in the throes of that, when he was able to take a step back and think about his experience and to understand what, as you said, it doesn't, it comes out of nowhere, but there's lead up, there's all these other processes, right? When he looked at those other processes and realized my anxiety is giving me incredible information about what I care about in life. And it's giving me incredible information about who I am as a person. And out of that, he created art. So that's one thing to say. Not every experience of anxiety is going to be creative. I think that, the thing about something like anxiety, though, is that if we assume it will damage us, it's like a wave, right? You can drown in a wave, but you can also ride it forward, and you can even surf it, I would argue. So there's this power, there's an alchemy to all of our difficult emotions. And so where we are on that spectrum for an individual person can start to motivate different aspects of anxiety, depending on who you are and what's going on in your life. Maybe taking one small step back too, and defining, from my perspective, what anxiety is. And this is really from emotion theory, functional emotion perspective in particular, as well as evolutionary theory. We equate anxiety with fear. But anxiety, while it feels like fear, is quite different. It makes us into these, as I say in the book, these mental time travelers into the future, because it's this feeling we get when we're apprehensive and imagining future uncertainty, something that could happen but hasn't happened yet. And uncertainty, by definition, is possibility. It means that something bad could happen, but something good could happen as well. And this is actually the same space, that discrepancy between where we are now and where it's possible to be, that creativity exists as well. And it's uncomfortable. Creativity isn't always, I had a prior life as a musician, and I'm surrounded by creatives. I'm very blessed with that in my life. And I feel that space of discomfort is also the creative space. Not that it's always effective, but it's that discrepancy. And so it hinges on this triumph of human evolution, our unique human capacity to imagine and project ourselves into the future. Imagine it, plan it, know that, yes, maybe the air could be sucked out of everything right now. Probably not, but it's this world of possibility, and our human brain can imagine it. And when we're in that space, sometimes it pushes us over too far, but other times, especially as we gain skill with learning to feel anxious in the right way, as Kierkegaard said 180 years ago, to learn, whosoever learns to be anxious in the right way has learned the ultimate. It's messy. It's this human condition. And the more we say, sometimes I'm going to fail, sometimes I'm not going to be up to the task. But anxiety is there, evolved with us to handle everything bad that could happen and every good possibility as well. My husband, if I could share something personal, we just learned the other day out of the blue that his retina in one eye is almost completely detached. And maybe you've gone through this. Well, he's in the process of after having the emergency surgery, it was hanging by a thread. He's had to be face down. and we think it's going to be a week. It might be 2 weeks. We feel very blessed that we found it. But I can tell you, both of our anxiety about this situation has really skyrocketed. It was at a point sometimes where I didn't feel quite up to the task of handling it. And I needed to rest and recover and sort of say, okay, this is not helpful anxiety right now. But because I'm used to surfing with anxiety and I've practiced it in my life, and I deeply value as well as don't like it, but I honor anxiety. I also found moments where that anxiety helped me. It helped me find a surgeon. We got the appointments early. I was there by his side. I took satisfaction in having that anxiety drive me to focus and do the things we needed to do. So it could have detached at any moment. We got the treatment we needed. I tell this story about how it helped me at one of the most stressful points in my life when my son was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition and he needed to have open heart surgery as an infant. So not easy, not good. Anxiety feels bad. But I, at the same time, believe it's there to be our partner as we face the nature of human existence, which is uncertainty.
This is why I really loved Ellen Vora's take on anxiety. She identifies 2 types of anxiety. Have you read her book?
I haven't read it yet, but it's right there on the shelf next to mine. I've heard podcasts with her. I think she's wonderful.
So it resonated with me a lot. And she talks about 2 types of anxiety very quickly: false anxiety and true anxiety. And your book dovetails very well with her book because you talk about true anxiety and she talks about the true anxiety too. Because false anxiety is when your anxiety can rise because you drank a lot of caffeine, you have issues of, in your gut, inflammation. She talks about sleep and food and all of those things. And I know personally that a lot of my anxieties were because of false anxiety. So in the past year, I have done a lot of things, including getting rid of caffeine. I broke up my 30-year relationship with coffee.
Oh, God bless you. I am drinking green tea right now, but
but my generalized anxiety disappeared immediately after I gave up caffeine. And in the past year, I haven't had a panic attack because I also got rid of gluten and dairy. And I started monitoring my blood sugar levels, and my anxiety was strongly related to my blood sugar dropping because I wasn't eating enough of food during the day, and I was eating the wrong foods, and it wasn't sustaining me for periods of times. So by doing some of those changes, I have not had physical anxieties, right? The somatic, because anxiety is in your body and also in your mind as a worry. And cognitive behavioral therapy is great if you have that mental anxiety, but physical anxiety, that's not going to help you. And I think a lot of people do experience this false anxiety, the physical anxiety. And I would encourage people to really change their life. Look at the things that they're doing, drinking alcohol or caffeine and all of those things, not eating properly, because it tremendously helps. And then there is the true anxiety that she talks about and you talk about. And we need to look at it and say, what's the message? After I started having those panic attacks, I started seeing a therapist. And one of the things he said to me was, it's a question that you ask in your book consistently, is what is your anxiety telling you? And the moment I started exploring and allowing myself to feel the horrible feelings that come with it, not the physical anxiety, but the real, true anxiety, I untangled and I realized what was my anxiety about. And I've shared this on a podcast, so I don't want to bore you or the listener. But I really like this distinction. It's really helpful.
I love that. And I was not completely aware of the elegance of that distinction that Dr. Vora was making. And I think it's wonderful too, because, and I think it does dovetail, as you say, with this message, because I think your ability to understand that was this false anxiety, meaning it was driven by some lifestyle choices, is what I'm taking that to mean. You could do that because you tuned into your anxiety. You didn't decide, oh, I'm feeling this, I'm just going to numb it or escape it. I think, for example, I think anti-anxiety medications are really needed for many people, but I think it's overprescribed and used just to allay any discomfort. And that's not the way they were intended. And I think it keeps us in the case that even that you're describing, maybe discovering some of these false anxieties because we immediately suppress it and we don't explore. So again, you're concerned that maybe I was going too far in my statement. My goal, even in discovering these false anxieties, is that once you're open and curious about anxiety, you will be better able to make those choices. If we start treating anxiety like health, mental health is health, which means you tune in, you're working to pursue a positive state, not just avoiding or eradicating a disease. You see the red flags and warning signs. Oh, wait a second, I'm drinking all this coffee every day and I feel jittery. Maybe I should pay attention to that. But it's this openness and curiosity that I feel we've lost in all of our conversations about anxiety that keep us from these excellent solutions.
100% agree, especially in the Western world where everything is so comfortable. Life is so comfortable here. We got used to one-click Amazon deliveries and instant gratifications and the Instacarts and all of the luxuries of life, right? So the moment you feel some angst, unease, you're like, wait a minute,
something's wrong.
Something is wrong. Let me get rid of this, right?
So that's what we teach our kids. And I think this is, I know that as a parent, as a strong parenting podcast and focus on parenting, I feel that this is why this message for all of us to have these conversations differently about anxiety, I think one of the most powerful impacts is with how we parent, how we work with our kids' difficult feelings as well.
I want to ask you, now that we, went into the parenting chapter, let's talk about that experiment that it was with the kids and their mothers. The mothers were, I think it was the space experiment, right?
Yes, this is Ellie Leibovitz and colleagues.
Yes. Can you talk about that? I thought that was a great experiment.
It's a beautiful study. So this is, a series, and actually a series, as you say, a series of studies as well, a therapeutic approach. So at the Yale Child Study Center, Ellie Leibovitz and his colleagues have been working on this new intervention. The acronym is SPACE. I really need to memorize what that stands for. It's supportive parenting for anxious kids. Essentially, it's supportive parenting for anxious kids. And the goal is to help the parents of anxious kids to stop what's termed over-accommodating. So we know that all of us, when we have kids who are anxious, we want to comfort them. We want to give them that support. But what you see over and over again in parents of kids who are extremely anxious or have clinical anxiety disorders, like in this study, is that they over-accommodate, which means they're very quick to remove the anxiety-provoking situation, avoid it, or
because it makes them uncomfortable, right?
Well, there's a whole thing about our own anxiety, about our kids' anxiety, 100%. But this is a pattern you see, again, with the best intentions from parents. But when we do that, we actually prevent our children from learning to cope with anxiety, to learn new skills, and to actually tolerate the discomfort that anxiety brings, so that it actually, again, is a recipe for anxiety to become worse. So Leibovitz and colleagues, they developed this intervention where they had the children of clinically anxious kids who'd come to the clinic. And for half of these kids in this study, they didn't give the kids therapy at all. They only taught the parents to stop over-accommodating. So if you have a kid who's who has separation anxiety disorder and the parent's sleeping with them every night, they teach the parents to stop sleeping with them every night and gradually help their child gain more independence and work through those anxieties, as one small example. And they did this for 6 weeks. So they worked with the parents built these skills. And then 6 weeks goes by. Meanwhile, the other half of this experimental group were kids who received gold standard cognitive behavioral therapy themselves. They compared the two groups. 87% of the kids whose parents only received this therapy, they showed clinically significant reductions in anxiety symptoms, comparable to the level of anxiety symptom reduction that the kids who received therapy themselves, the gold standard cognitive behavioral therapy, received. So these kids were doing as well and didn't have a bit of therapy. Now, again, this is not parent blaming, but what it's saying is that we parents, with the best of intentions, can be linchpins in these vicious cycles of avoidance of anxiety and this sort of blocking of allowing our kids to build new skills that help them cope. So it's a beautiful study. They're developing a whole intervention approach based on this, Leibovitz and colleagues. And I think it's a really wonderful therapeutic approach. And I think it really should be a first-line treatment.
What I also loved in your book is your personal example with your son learning how to ride a bike.
Oh God, my parenting fails are all in there on full display.
and I loved the transcription of the audio. Tell that story. It's really great. I love that story.
Thank you. So my son, who from very early on, I noticed is a little on the anxious side, of course, being someone who studies anxiety. But these were anxieties and fears.
Can I pause here for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
So you said in the beginning that your son, as an infant, went through open heart surgery.
Yes.
And then of course he's gonna have tendencies towards anxiety, right?
I don't know the data.
You don't think that's connected? You don't think that anxiety is also a byproduct of trauma?
I think we overuse the word trauma.
I agree with that too. Yes.
So as an infant, I think it was physically traumatic. And I know even he was 4 months old, the level of awareness he would have had, I imagine, on multiple levels would have been traumatic. At the same time, and I know, and there's wonderful research about how we do carry traumatic memories in our body. However, I also deeply believe in our anti-fragility and resilience. I believe that an anti-fragility meaning that some systems and aspects of being human grow stronger through adversity. We assume that adversity always causes weakness. I think there's great evidence to suggest it doesn't. A great example is the immune system, that without the adversity of being exposed to germs and viruses cannot function, actually literally cannot function. It requires that exposure to mount an immune response. I don't know that he was traumatized by that, but I consider that option to be open. I think temperamentally, he might have just been a little more inhibited, a little shyer. But whatever the case, the roots are there. And my daughter's not at all anxious. So, right, again, she had different infant experiences. But the story goes but okay, here I have this, slightly anxious child. And he's a city boy. He grew up in New York City. And he's about 9 years old at the time. And I grew up in the suburbs where, riding a bike, I don't know, it signified something to me. I figured it was time for him to start learning. And so, okay, we're learning. He gets very frightened and anxious quite immediately. And not at the time, I started getting anxious about his anxiety, right? Despite all of my talk, right? But I was determined that he should learn. But so we're learning in upstate New York. It's not optimal. It's like on a gravel road, and it's this old BMX bike that's heavy and difficult to learn on, but I was just determined he should learn. And so we're doing it, and he's really struggling. And at the end of our session, I'd been videotaping him. I put the phone in my pocket and we walk up the hill to go back home. And unbeknownst to me, the video had been recording the entire time, which was a blessing because my perception, so we're walking up the road, I'm giving him what I think is a pep talk, is essentially a tough love, right? And you can do it, But I get to the top of the road, he's despondent, he goes to his room. I pick my phone out, oh my gosh, it'd been recording. I press replay, I watch, and I literally burst into tears almost as I'm replaying this because it was not tough love, whatever that means, that I was giving him. I was denying the validity of anxiety. I was like, come on, bud. I was essentially telling him, man up. Why are you so afraid? You shouldn't be afraid. Maybe I should push you off your bike and you'll realize it. I said terrible things. And I really, again, it was such a gift that I could see myself reflected back, what I didn't. And I realized how much anxiety I was having, that he maybe couldn't do this. And for whatever reasons, I needed him to be able to do it. So I tell the story. I literally transcribed what was on the video so people could really see what a huge failure of parenting this was. But the beautiful part of that story too was that no failure is true. Very few failures are irreparable. So after I watched this, I took a breath, got myself, in a good, calm place where I could be open again. And went to him and said, bud, I want to show you something. I played him the video so he could hear it. And I said, honey, I was really wrong. And I really need to tell you why. You had every right to feel scared. You had every right to be anxious. And this is on me. This is me making a mistake and telling you that it wasn't okay for you to feel these feelings. And I love you just the way you are. I think that you were right to be scared. Of course you were. So when you're ready, if you're ready, we can do it again. But I just want you to know that this was my mistake and I'm sorry. And his little tense shoulders went down and he said, thanks, Mom. Like, I get it. And later he did, he decided he wanted to learn to ride a bike again. And it wasn't perfect. But we came through that experience so much stronger. We came through that experience, me wiser, realizing, and I think he realized that we could accept his anxiety together and that we could work through it. And it was one of the best parenting experiences of my life. And, again, starting is a huge fail.
Hey, do you love the podcast? Show your support by becoming a patron on patreon.com and join our 15 existing members who believe and support the work of authentic parenting. Patreon is a place where creators, artists, and podcasters get support from their fans. Your contribution makes a difference. When you become a patron at any level, I'll send you a handwritten thank you card with some awesome authentic parenting merch. A tote bag, a pen, a t-shirt, a mug. You'll be part of the special insiders circle and get other benefits as well. Discounts on my services and offerings, extra content, and of course, exclusive access to me. You can stop your contribution at any time. A lot goes into the production of the podcast, and I truly need your help. Head over to patreon.com/authentic parenting. The link is in your show notes as well. And join other big-hearted and generous listeners from around the world. It's not the amount that matters, it's the fact that you give that matters. After all, I created this podcast and built our community on the notion of giving. We have different levels of support starting from $2 a month. If you break it down, it comes down to 50 cents per episode. $2 can't even get you a cup of hot drink in a major US city. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being part of our global, diverse, and strong community. Your support truly matters. Simply visit patreon.com/authentic parenting and choose a level of support today. Again, visit patreon.com/authentic parenting and choose a level of support. Now, back to the show. Your son now is a teenager, correct?
Correct. He's 13.
He's 13. So how is he coping with anxiety? What's going on? How are you helping him? Is he still the anxious kid? How are you supporting him in that? What has he learned? Has he learned more the mindset that you're talking about? I mean, have you imparted all this information to him, or you're just a typical mom, just the rest of us?
I'm sure I'm still a typical mom. But, we talk about, part of it, I think, is we just talk about anxiety all the time. We notice it. We normalize it. Mm-hmm. He does have some anxieties. I think he's, I think like all of us, it ebbs and flows. He might be a little more anxious than his peers, but God, this pandemic, I mean, what a kick in the butt for all of us, and, he is he's a firstborn. He's a bit of a perfectionist. I really work with him on channeling that perfectionism, which does not serve us. Perfectionism is this standard of flawlessness that always gets in our way and is not helpful. But there's a light side of perfectionism, which is excellencism. And that's this belief that we can make mistakes, that we can work towards good things and being really good and even excellent. We have the ability, but we have to fail along the way. And, people who are excellencists, who work towards that, who strive, are actually more anxious than the average person, but they channel that. So we talk a lot about that. When he's worried about getting, his grades, we just talk through and say, well, what's the worst that could happen? Oh, I might get a B+. I'm like, buddy, It's like, let's, he's like, I know that you don't, that you don't expect this, but I have these expectations. And I say, well, let's talk about where that could come from. And maybe some of it is from us unconsciously. And let's really just put that out on the table and talk about, or if you're feeling anxiety in this moment, what can you do that helps you? Maybe in the moment you have to, not just work with anxiety. Maybe you have to let go of it for a while. Sometimes anxiety isn't useful information. And anxiety that sends us into the future tense, the title of my book, sometimes it spirals us. Sometimes it's too diffuse. It's not anchored in anything that gives us a sense of purpose. So we learn to let go. We learn, it's like alchemical, our negative emotions, our difficult emotions, we can work through them. We can leverage them, but sometimes we need to turn the dial down. My lab is the emotion regulation lab. It's about that modulation. It's about those ups and downs, but know that you can do it. Know that you don't have to hate your negative feelings or think that something's wrong with you. You can work with it. Sometimes it will get the better of you. I mean, as my husband's been struggling with his health problems, I've not had great evenings every night. Anxiety stinks, but it's also helped me focus. So we have those conversations and we find the ways to kind of start to feel like I can be anxious in the right way. And sometimes I can be a break and do those things that bring me to the present moment, that soothe me, that also help me. Exercise is a great way to feel better. Walking. I love to walk. I love to write poetry. It's terrible poetry, probably 90% of the time, but it helps me shift my mindset. I become a surfer of those waves, and it just makes me feel like it's all the messy, beautiful ways of being human, and it changes my mindset.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. The general message here is embrace all of your feelings, whether it's anxiety or any other uncomfortable feeling, right? Because they're there for a reason. All our emotions have a purpose and a function. But like we said many times in this conversation, we've learned somehow to not tolerate them, to medicate them, to soothe them, because those things are available, right? What do you see? Commercials on TV? Like, I think 90% of the commercials, I don't watch TV, but most of the commercials are drugs to alleviate a certain condition.
Yeah.
There's the food industry. Johann Hari, whom I interviewed, has written a fantastic book that I highly recommend. It's called Stolen Focus. It's
yes, he's brilliant. And I love his book on depression was wonderful.
Excellent.
Taking a very similar approach. So yeah, I haven't made I'm a little in the midst of things right now, but I haven't made my way through his book, but I think that his message is spot on. The role of technology and how we think about that is very wise.
I think not only technology, but also the food industry, right?
Yes.
What we eat, what we put in our body, of course, it's going to create this false anxiety. Because if you're putting junk food, empty carbs, sugar, I mean, what are we feeding our children? And most of the parents that I work with oftentimes complain that their children are misbehaving. There are children who are more sensing. Like, I am a highly sensitive person myself. I have tendencies towards anxiety, but I also feel the world more deeply and I sense the world more deeply. I see the colors more brightly, the sun rises and everything. And I'm a very creative person. These are interlinked, right? And oftentimes mental illness and creativity are linked. And we've known this for a long time, or, a lot of the great poets, artists, creators, musicians have struggled with some kind of mental health issue. There's no doubt that they're also very creative, people who have, not everybody, but there is a strong link. The food that we consume is of course, it's not gonna, it's going to create anxiety. It's going to create that false anxiety. That's why I love Ellen's work so much, because it gives a different explanation. And when we take care of that, we can see, is my child really anxious? Is this anxiety telling something? Or is this about the food? Did my child sleep enough? I have a teenager too. My daughter is 14. Do teenagers get enough sleep? Do children get enough sleep? I work with parents, and the reality is children are chronically sleep deprived as their parents. Of course, sleep deprivation is going to affect your overall well-being. They consume bad food most of the time, what children eat. They're on devices all the time. They don't get physical activity. They don't get unstructured free play. They lead sedentary lifestyles, most of the kids. They're in car seat going places and having some stupid extracurricular activity for like 1 hour. Then they go home and they're sedentary. They don't spend time with their parents because most of the time they are in school. They don't have connection time. They don't have meaningful, warm relationships. That's a recipe for disaster. And of course, that child is going to feel anxiety about all of it because they don't have time to process their feelings, their thoughts. And then they have the busy parent who is wrapped up in their life. And this is nothing against your book or against you. It's just me getting on my soapbox, talking about this. And you're welcome to comment if you want to.
I would like to comment after you're done.
But then the parent is also busy, is also on their devices, is also not eating well. They don't spend enough time, nurturing their own social cups, and they are burnt out and spent. And of course, they can't give to their children what their children need. And this is the reality of today's modern parenting. And of course, everybody's mental illness is on the rise, depression, anxiety, suicide, because what is happening? It's our life. It's not one factor. You know what I mean? We can't pinpoint and say it's bad parenting. It's the food. This is a complex thing. And where do we get any solutions? I don't know. But we need a systemic change. We need a lot of things. So please comment.
Here's where, and I agree with you entirely about the nature of the lives we're leading. I think here's where this, and I think that, this distinction of true and false anxiety, I see that there's a lot of utility, but I actually take a little bit issue with that terminology, because I think anxiety that derives from food, from sleep, from these, is actually still very useful information because it points us, because anxiety is not out here as this separate thing. It is the holistic self. And we treat mental health like it's not health, but it is. So when we have anxiety from these other sources, I don't think that's false anxiety. I think it's pointing us. It's a signal of all these things that you're mentioning. So again, that doesn't mean, that requires us though to understand the difference and still have that wisdom to say, wait a second, there are these other sources versus what you're terming and Dr. Vora term, this true anxiety. But I still think it's valid anxiety. Anxiety is the smoke alarm telling us that our house is on fire, whether it's because of a traumatic experience, whether it's because of just the ups and downs of lives, or whether it's because we don't get enough sleep and don't eat properly and aren't having proper relationships. So for me, anxiety is a way in when we listen to it and we start that journey. It's not a solution per se, but the first step has to be honoring it. And making those distinctions. That's the first thing I'd say. And again, agreeing with you about this sort of the state that we're in. The other thing I think is that with all of these things that you very eloquently and rightly point out about our lives now, some common denominators. I think of the classic work by Erich Fromm, and I'm such an experimentalist. I'm a neuroscientist. I do all this work, but I go back to the humanists all the time. Erich Fromm wrote this beautiful book post World War II called The Sane Society, and the revolution of what he was saying is kind of this post-Freudian era. And after and I can use the word trauma when it comes to World War II, after the collective trauma of World War II, was that he's saying, listen, anxiety doesn't just reside in the individual, it resides in the society in which we live. And a society that is sane is one that allows us to love and be loved, that allows us to know the difference between truth and falsehood, and that allows us to be the author of our own autonomous creative power, to feel that we can do things in the world and have autonomy and create. And everything you described about our life right now are violations of that sanity. And so when we think of it that way, we can start to say, okay, anxiety is telling me something's wrong with my life, with the choices. And I can start and seeing where it's breaking down in these ways of connection, of purpose, of meaning, of love, and of falsehood and what's truth and falsehood. And that's where we can start to make those changes in our life. So I think, and for me, in the last chapter of the book, I finally get a little bit in the self-help realm. I don't think of this book as a self-help book in some ways. It's an idea book. I just ask people to consider this new way of thinking about anxiety. But in that last chapter, I have these three sort of principles. And the first one is, anxiety is information, listen to it. The second is sometimes anxiety is not useful, and so let it go. And here's some principles for that. But then the third is, if anxiety is useful, connect it to a sense of purpose, connect it to something in your life that makes you, that gives you meaning, that makes you feel that life is worth living. We all have that. And if we don't, then that's the work to start to be done. And that's where we help our children. If we see that they're eating in ways that make their body feel like trash, if they're using social media in ways that make them believe that they're a product to be sold, that their only value is in how many clicks and likes or shares or followers they have. If we see those patterns, then we know that we're off on their sense of purpose, and we can start taking action. And our anxiety for our kids helps us, take that purposeful action. Purpose doesn't have to be a big mission in life or some grand vision. It's saying, you know what? I want to be socially connected with my community, and I'm going to do something to help. Or it's that I want to, we, don't take enough walks in our family, or we, being physically fit is going to help all of us. And so we're going to prioritize taking hikes every week or every other week, whatever we can start to do. It's those types of things. Or maybe it is a grand vision. Maybe it's like helping people figure out parenting, or helping people feel less broken, or whatever it is. But anxiety, it doesn't have to disrupt us in those purpose. It doesn't have to disrupt our kids. It can help point us to our North Stars about what really matters to us. And so when I was hearing you speak and say all those, what I think of as really truths, that's where my mind was going.
Very well said. You cited the study in the book about optimism and pessimism. I was wondering if you can say a few words about that. Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Well, there's several, but I think, in terms of this work, that's coming, a lot of it's come out of the depression and suicide literature. I think if you're referring to
it's when you think of 4 events that are neutral or negative, how it impacts your mood and your anxiety.
Yes. That is a fascinating study.
Yes,
Yeah. And in that, I'm blanking on the authors' names, and I'm sorry. No, people don't often ask me about that study. It's a really great one. I can look up the authors of that because I'd really love to. I think it might have been the Robinson et al. 2012 study, but I can double confirm that. But so this is a study in which, we assume that anxiety is about threat, that it's about fear, right? But anxiety is about uncertainty. And so they did this beautiful thing where they had people imagine and do exercises over time where they imagined something good happening in the future, something bad happening, or something just neutral. Like imagine the future where you're brushing your teeth, or, something that was truly, I guess that's kind of positive, but, something where it's just like habitual, just something that was predictable in a regular routine. And what they found is that when people over time just were envisioning this sort of neutral but predictable future, anxiety went down. That it's not that we have to negate all the threat. It's not that we have to just boost the positive all the time. Just having a sense that there's this uncertain future, but there's something that we can do to sort of feel that we can, maybe not control it, but have a plan. And that's, that it soothes anxiety. It keeps it to manageable levels. And that's the beauty of anxiety, because we have to, and this is where it's a triumph of human evolution. It requires us to hold in mind at the same time a future that we're simulating, right? This is this human capacity. And often in exquisite detail, where something bad could happen, we have to hold that. Something good could happen. And both are possible. It's uncertain. So our body, our mind, our biological response, our cognitive response prepares us to avert disaster and make those positive realities into reality. And that's this amazing thing that I only really understood about anxiety because I'm an emotion scientist. That yes, I'm a clinical psychologist. I've devoted my life to understanding and preventing anxiety disorders, but the emotion of anxiety has these beautiful facets to it that are really quite remarkable.
I interviewed someone, her name is, she wrote the book, 90 Seconds to a Life You Love. Dr. John Rosenberg.
Yes, I've not read that book, but I am familiar with
I know.
it.
I'm not suggesting you read all the books that I mentioned.
I love these books. I wish I had. This is what I need to prioritize in my life. She wrote this book. I interviewed her. In there, she talks about, emotional health, feeling our feelings. You two have a very similar message.
She doesn't talk about anxiety per se. She talks about embracing all the uncomfortable feelings, etc. And she identifies 8 core emotions, which anxiety is not one of them. And she specifically states that there's a reason she doesn't talk about anxiety as an emotion, and she doesn't put it in the list of the 8 emotions, because she thinks that we overuse anxiety. And she thinks it's just this blanket clock, so to speak, that we use for everything. And she asks a question. I just remembered this when you were speaking. She says, when you feel anxious, when you're saying to yourself, I'm anxious because of this, I have anxiety, I'm feeling anxious, whatever the sentence is, change the word anxious or anxiety with the word vulnerable and see what you get. And I've been trying that when I interviewed her like a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. I think it was pretty interesting. I'm feeling anxious about this test, for example, let's say a teenager, change the word anxious. I'm feeling vulnerable about the standardized testing. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was an interesting way of thinking about it. So what do you think?
I take a little issue with that because, again, as you might imagine, I think that's pathologizing anxiety. Because sometimes when I feel anxious, I feel activated. And that's actually why in the creativity research, one of the explanations for why anxiety can increase creativity is because, like happiness, like anger and other emotions, from a functional perspective, it's an activating emotion. Well, I'll tell you another beautiful study that I talk about in the book, and that people who also study stress have talked about. And it's Jameson and colleagues, 2013. Researchers at Harvard, they invited socially anxious people into the lab. So these are people with a diagnosis of social anxiety. And the core symptom of social anxiety is a fear of public humiliation, of being judged. So they invited them in, and then they had them do something that is literally a torture session for all of us, but especially socially anxious folks, which is to impromptu give a public speech on a contentious topic like the death penalty, in front of a panel of judges who were actually research assistants trained to give all these, negative nonverbal signals of, being like arms crossed, judgmental. And they just had a couple minutes to prepare. Now, half of this group that they decided, okay, you're going to be doing this thing. Half of the group, they took aside and they said, listen, you're going to feel your heart racing. You're going to sweat. You're going to feel butterflies, and you're going to feel all these feelings. This is your stress and anxiety preparing you to act. Here are actually a bunch of studies that show that when our body is mounting this response, it's optimizing, we're optimizing our ability to perform at our peak. And here's several scientific studies that show this. And by the way, here's evolutionary theory, because by the way, Darwin's, the 3rd book in his trilogy on evolutionary theory was called The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals. One of those emotions was anxiety that he wrote about 150 years ago. And they said, there's this evolutionary adaptive quality. It protects you, it prepares you, and it propels you forward. So they got this little tutorial on the benefits of anxiety. Half of the people did not get this tutorial. And then during giving the speech, they're measuring blood pressure, heart rate, and they're monitoring their performance. The people who learned that anxiety could be a potential ally was helping them perform. They perform better, fewer stutters, fewer ahs, more confident looking, and their heart rates were lower, and their blood pressure was lower. So their cardiovascular profile was transformed to be someone, not that they were like calm, it's not like they were asleep, but they looked like people who were preparing to act and who were striving, not looking like people who were stressed or overwhelmed. And the other half of the group that didn't learn that about anxiety, they did not have that. They looked less like that profile and they performed less well. So this small mind shift, they didn't go in thinking they were vulnerable. They came in thinking they were prepared. And I think if we can make these mindset shifts every time, it won't work every time. We have to give ourselves the opportunity to fail or to not be at our best 100%. But if we do this small mindset shift, I believe that we can actually use anxiety in these productive ways and really do the best we can do in that moment. And it's, again, do the best we can do, which is not perfect, but it's at that moment the best we can do.
I find that fascinating, number one. Second, how about flow states, optimum performance and creativity?
Yes.
I mean, like we know that if you're in a flow state, you're way more creative. When you're relaxed and you're safe, you're more at ease and your mind can come up with solutions, like mind wandering, the default mode network. When you're taking a shower and you've been grappling with a hard problem, you're taking a shower, boom, your idea, pops up, or you're taking a walk after having dealt with a difficult decision. When you are out of the problem, your mind wanders, you're relaxed, you're in a safe space, then you come up with a solution, with a creative idea. I don't know, I'm not buying this creativity aspect or anxiety makes us perform better. Again, that's, to me, is a definition. It's a question of how are we defining anxiety and what kind of anxiety are we talking about?
Well, in the flow example you gave, it's actually not a relaxed state when you're in flow. Flow is a match between your ability and the challenge. We're not in flow when it's easy. We're in flow when there's challenge.
Yes, just
so when I talk
challenge.
about Yes. So it's not relaxed and laid back. It's actually, I would argue, a little bit of anxiety, because to the degree that there's a future orientation, you're working for something, it's uncertain what you're doing, but you believe that you have what it takes to do it. You have that experience. Because those folks who I think achieve a lot of flow states, let's think elite athletes, they have learned a lot of mastery over anxiety, how to be anxious in the right way. And again, I'm not talking about panic when I talk about anxiety and creativity. None of these studies I cite, neither the one I just cited, nor the DeDrew study, nor several other that I cite, these are not states where we're overwhelmed or panicked. Those are states, these are states where we feel it. We feel that we're about to be challenged. And maybe we're, we have those butterflies. We even are sweating. Maybe we're very nervous. But we're still able to work with it and practice it, and over time get better at that. And it's a practice like any other. It's a skill. So I really, and if you talk to any artist on the planet, my husband is actually in the entertainment industry, and we have the blessing of having many artists around us who are amazing people. Talk to any of them. I talk to Broadway performers all the time. Talk about a high pressure. My respect for the Broadway community is through the roof. You talk and they're like, if I'm not, they've told me things like, if I'm not throwing up in the bathroom before I go on for my big solo, something's wrong, because I'm not in it to win it. I've learned to deal with those
anxiety.
Nerves,
is that anxiety or fear
anxiety.
Response? Or
fear is the feeling that we have when there is certain and present danger in the moment. It's like it's the snake about to bite you. It's someone holding a knife to your throat. That is fear. It roots you to the present. It has nothing to do with the future. It has nothing to do with hope. Anxiety is all about what's coming around the bend, waiting for those doctor results to come back, knowing whether my husband's retina is attached again. It's knowing that I'm about to perform this solo and I'm a dancer and I could fall flat on my face. It's uncertainty in the future. It is not fear, although it does share some of the biological response with fear.
Yeah, very, 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 very interesting. Also, I want to ask you, before I let you go, I want to ask you about dopamine and oxytocin.
Yes.
Which you talked about that. That was a surprising element for me to learn about anxiety.
It was surprising to me. And I spent a lifetime studying anxiety. But please, sorry, I'm interrupting you. But
tell us that dopamine circuitry, the neurotransmitter dopamine and the hormone oxytocin are involved in the experience of anxiety.
Yeah. So much of science, we're humans, right? We scientists, it's the questions we ask. So it's only been in the past 10 or 20 years that we thought to say, we think, it's anxiety. It's all about threat detection and response. It's the fear circuitry. It's this. Well, people over the past 20 years have started to examine what happens, in our neurotransmitter systems, our hormones that go outside this kind of fear realm. So there's excellent evidence to suggest that when we're anxious, the social bonding hormone oxytocin actually increases. Now, oxytocin actually primes us to seek social connection. It's the hormone that increases when we give birth, when we're bonding with our children, when we're nursing, or when or even when we're with our loved ones. So it's experienced in those contexts, but also primes us to connect. And so the evidence suggests that when we have these anxious states, it's actually pushing us to seek connection and reassurance. And what is one of the best ways to modulate anxiety, to actually manage it? It's to do emotional outsourcing. It's to seek that social connection. So there's almost this fractal beauty to anxiety that it contains within it itself these means to actually seek that support and manage whatever stress and strain and anxiety we're experiencing in the moment. And so that's one fascinating thing. And with dopamine, again, this is the feel-good hormone, right? We think it's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. We think it's all the, gaming, we think it's addiction. But dopamine does increase in those contexts. But dopamine is this messenger neurotransmitter that does many other things in the brain. And what it does is it shuttles between areas of the brain that need to work together when we're pursuing goals. So dopamine spikes when we have a goal to work towards, when we have rewards that we want to really persist in pursuing. And so it activates us and marshals our resources to make our dreams come true. And when we're anxious, dopamine also increases, which shows us that anxiety isn't just this fear, isn't just dreading the negative. It's knowing that the positive is possible, that you're in it to win it, and you have the potential to make that future reality come true that you want.
I love how you said in the beginning too that there's that possibility, right, of the future. So you can envision a better future or negative future, but somehow we always think of the negative, right? Isn't the human brain with the negativity bias like we're skewed towards the negative? So can we train?
We are we can train, but there is a negativity bias for good reason, right? We need to pay attention when something negative is happening. But that's where leaning into these difficult emotions benefits us, because it's about flexibility. As you mentioned in the beginning, I study emotion regulation. We used to think that emotion regulation was just suppressing bad emotions. We've moved far beyond that, luckily, in the past 20 or 30 years of research. We know that the key to healthy emotional lives is flexibility. And so, it really is that ability to kind of be, to increase, to decrease, and to have that full range of experience.
Can the degrees of anxiety be measured? I know it's a very subjective individual experience, right? Like what I feel as anxiety emotion or what you feel is probably different, even though there are similarities, right? We understand what anxiety is. Like even in your book, you say, you're not defining anxiety because we all know what it feels like, what it is, yeah. Right? We all know, but do we? Because it sounds like I am a little confused after reading your book. Mm-hmm. Now I have questions. I'm like, maybe the things that I'm feeling are not anxiety, and anxiety is what you are describing, is that emotion that we all feel, but the things that I'm feeling maybe are not anxiety, maybe they are different things, or maybe vice versa. That's right? So interesting. Do we need definition? Do we need more terms? Are there degrees of anxiety? Because you're using the word anxiety to describe this emotion, but are you again using it as a blanket term for something else? You know what I mean?
I do. I'm a scientist. Yeah. And before that, I was actually a classical musician. And our brain and the brain works the same way in both, which is all about deconstruction, right? About breaking something down to its pieces, right? And so for me, the solution to this difficulty of us calling every uncomfortable feeling anxiety was not to go too far, but actually to break it down and get more precise in our language. The English language lacks precision when it comes to this feeling. And so what I actually tried to do was really, by talking, and really even in the title, future tense, to really break down that, and as you say, I started by saying, we all know what anxiety feels like. And I said that more to say, it feels bad. What I meant by that is like, we know it feels bad. Let's acknowledge that it stinks. But really, but by being very specific in what counts as anxiety and what is not, I've tried to give us sort of some handles to hold on to in terms of making the distinction that you say, well, maybe I'm just excited. And, maybe that is, but it's on this spectrum still of thinking into the future. The key is the goal that we think about, that it's future and it's uncertain, and that we hold in our mind the possibility of good and bad happening. So for me, every time I'm in a situation and I'm feeling uncomfortable, I can do this sort of mental kind of exercise of saying, okay, what am I feeling right now? And, when I also feel that it's something I care about, when I feel a sense of hope, when I know it's about uncertainty, that's another signal I know it's anxiety. As you mentioned in the very beginning, I personally in my life have struggled with depression. And I didn't write my first book about depression. I think it was almost too close to me. And I think it's harder because I suffered from it, But the thing about depression is that it doesn't contain within it hope anymore. And right, because it's really despair. It's that loss of the positive. It's that loss of autonomy, of believing you can change things. And when I worked through and struggled and did come out the other side of clinical depression, not that I don't still feel depression sometimes, but came out the other side of clinical depression, I actually think it was my ability to hope, to care, maybe to be anxious, that helped me counteract some of that. And so the way that I use anxiety in my life, I use it as a tool almost. I use it in this, it almost is an alchemical way, right? When we transform lead into gold, or when we transform one difficult thing or one ugly thing into something more beautiful. And I think that might have been something that saved me a little bit, that I was able to cultivate a sense of hope out of despair, that I was able to cultivate a sense of possibility. I'm a person who's expansive to a fault, right? So I feel like it was something that I actually used in my own personal life in a productive way to counteract these other, well, for my personal vulnerabilities.
I think Matthew Lieberman's research on labeling emotions, right? Particularly, I think he talks about particularly like negative emotions, anxiety and fear and things like that, decreases the activity in the amygdala. So I think labeling what we are feeling is important, right? And there is the Brené Brown new series on HBO Max, which I have recently watched, based on her book, The Atlas of Emotions, which I would say the book was disappointing than the series. The series is much more interesting. She does talk about language and labeling our emotions, because that helps us to decrease, as Matthew Lieberman's research suggests, the activity in the amygdala, that is not as scary. And you talk about this mindset and framing what we're feeling and what's the purpose of it. If it's not useful, just let it go. And sometimes it's pretty useful, because sometimes people can be stuck in unhelpful, negative cycles and feel entitled to their pain, to their suffering, to their trauma, to their anxiety. And I feel like they need to hear that in that moment when you're stuck, it's not serving you. Recognize that you're stuck in that place, and maybe you need to get out of it to see the forest, so to speak, right? Because you are stuck. You don't have that expansive view. So mindset plays a role. I think leaning in and feeling negative feelings and embracing all of it and not being afraid, because it's important, and labeling what we're feeling, because it's going to help us regulate. Because if I don't know that I'm feeling anxiety or arousal or stress or overwhelm, then I'm going to panic about it. But because everything is so nuanced and we have such limited vocabulary, as Brené Brown mentioned in that series, she said that they asked, I believe, 7,000 people, how many emotions do you recognize in yourself and others? And the average
there are
number,
a lot of them.
and the average person recognized only 3. So if we recognize only 3 emotions in us and in others, we're going to be engulfed by the experience of those emotions.
I am so glad you brought up this point. It's so crucial. And I think you said it so beautifully. As an emotion regulation researcher and someone who's a developmentalist as well, one of the first things we've understood from decades of research is that teaching kids how to, put words to emotions is one of the core building blocks of a healthy emotional life. And we sometimes call it things like emotional granularity. But what is that? That's about being able to actually sit with a feeling in a granular, specific way and explore it, right? And so I think you're so right that this attitude of exploration, not that we need, I never want to suggest that we need to just increase our anxiety and use it and be type A people. It's really not what I'm saying. And I do try to correct that. If I miscommunicated that in any way, I really do try to correct that. But it's also not a habit to break. It's an emotion that we need to lean into to understand and to gain wisdom through naming it, through accepting it, even though we don't have to accept having it be the way it is, having that granularity and believing that it's possible to work with it, that it's a part of being human, not some outside attacker, that it's an ally, but not an enemy. But you have to negotiate with allies sometimes. And so this whole ally analogy is like, yes, it's an ally, but you have to negotiate with it because it's not always comfortable to be in this alliance. So those are the conversations, and that's the approach. And I think if we can do that, everything else, all the other solutions we pursue, and there are excellent ones out there. I do not disregard any of them. The science-based wellness practices, eating, that, the wisdom of eating and sleeping and having that be your first, step to health, which includes mental health. All of that is crucial. But until we change our relationship with our difficult emotions, those are not going to work as well. We will do unhelpful things. And so the sole purpose of my book is to ask people to consider, to be curious about these difficult emotions, engage them, believe you can work with them, and then do all these other things to promote yourself and heal yourself that you might be doing, and find those things. That's the sole purpose of my book.
And that is the core message that I took away from your book. But I was like, then why is she talking about anxiety? Why is she not talking about all of the quote unquote difficult negative emotions? Why did she zero in on anxiety?
That's a good question. I felt anxiety is it is the most common mental health problem, right? It's also the one that has become the new stress. I feel like it is the zeitgeist now of how we're describing all those difficult emotions, which we don't have words for. And I also feel like to do the science real credit, to really convey it, I needed to start with a focus. Now, I now realize that I need to write probably 7 other books. And I need to rescue each of the difficult emotions from bad PR to explore them. And it won't be the same story for everyone. I think my next book maybe should be depression. I don't know. It will be personally very challenging for me. Yeah. I think it'll be a real exploration for my, I'll really have to bring everything that I have and to understand the role it played in my own life, which was very significant. But you're right. All of the emotions need their own book.
Very nice. Well, I could talk to you for hours.
Oh, same, Anna. What a pleasure to speak with you.
Even though I am pushing you and challenging you, I really enjoyed this conversation. And I think I asked you all the things that I wanted to ask, after I read your book. I highlighted and I have my notes here on the table. I'm trying to glance. Did I forget? Because there were a lot of interesting studies that you cited in the book. What is your hope for this book now that it's in the world? It has a life of its own. What is your hope?
My hope is that it spurs more conversations like this. My hope is that it becomes part of the dialogue, because I think that our language and our way of approaching anxiety is getting in our way. And I welcome people pushing back, because that's how things get better. That's how we become excellencists.
I love that.
All right. And I just, I'm very grateful to you and to others who are talking about this book, because I think that, more conversations are good, but we also have to have, I think, the right conversations and get away from stigmatizing all difficult emotions.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it. And it shattered some of your existing ideas about anxiety. I would love to know what your biggest takeaway is from this episode. Did you find it useful? What do you think about the link between anxiety and creativity? How could you describe your own anxiety experience? Get in touch. I love hearing from you. Send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. Call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, I have a free tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact, access the tool, and send me a voice message. If you enjoy the podcast, you can help us out by rating it on Apple Podcasts, or better yet, writing a short review. Tell us why you love the show and what are your favorite guests, episodes, or topics. Also, consider becoming a patron on patreon.com. With a small monthly contribution, you can support your favorite show and get supporter-only benefits, content, and exclusive access to me. join our 18 existing members who together contribute $87 towards our monthly goal of $500. You can learn more and choose your level of support at patreon.com/authentic parenting, or just click the link in your show notes. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and elsewhere. And of course, if you want to see what I'm up to in my private life, behind the scenes of podcasting, stay up to date with authentic parenting, follow me on Instagram, the only social media platform that I use and somewhat enjoy. Until next week, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.